Welcome, one and all, to another Mere Mortals interview. I had the absolute pleasure today of chatting with Jacqui Ooi. Jacqui is a fantastic, amazing woman. She's got many different talents and has used them varyingly across her career as well. She first started off as a journalist working in women's magazines before transitioning into senior communication roles in large charities, most notably ChildFund Australia and the Smith family, before taking another venture into the podcasting world. So she runs a podcast called the What She Did Next podcast. Highly recommended. I've listened to a couple of episodes and really enjoying what she's doing. In this conversation, though, we focused on her career path and I suppose her intrinsic motivation for the different steps that she's taken, most notably in the charity and volunteering section and why she enjoys that. Before getting on to her podcasting, how she finds guests, why she chose to focus on women in particular and women doing different things and creating businesses, for example. Before finally going on to my favorite topic of interest, travel. So we talked about her travels as when she was younger and what she hopes to do in the future with traveling. I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, and I bring you Jacqui Ooi. One of the things we like to kick off with, Jacqui, is a mere mortal moment of the week. So I suppose like a little piece of introspection you've had of something that's made you think, yes, I am a mere mortal.
Well, yeah, I guess at the moment we've just moved. So it's all about, we've just relocated from Brisbane back down to just south of Sydney, on that little coastal area just south of Sydney. And so I think it's just been, we've got a lot to do. We've got to find somewhere to live, sorting out work, all the rest of it. And I think, just in the moments where it started to all feel a little bit overwhelming at times, I'm like, you just have to take all of this one step at a time. We've done this before. We've had many new beginnings and new chapters and things. But I think it's just taking that moment to step back and go, we don't have to figure everything out right now. Everything works out as it's meant to. I've just had to do a few of those little reminders this week and, not get too overwhelmed by the to-do lists, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny how that creeps up on you. Like it can be, exactly the same thing. Say you've moved house before, but it'll still feel like something totally new, something like, oh man, I don't know if I can handle this.
I think so. And because this feels like a little bit more of a, I wouldn't say permanent move. Things can always change. But, we moved up to Brisbane from Sydney just over a couple of years ago. And that was, we were feeling ready for a big change and we wanted to, move to a more coastal or regional area. So Brisbane was always going to be a bit of a stepping stone to somewhere. We didn't know exactly where. We'd thought about the northern New South Wales area where my mum was living. We'd thought about the Sunshine Coast where a few friends had moved to, but long story short, some family circumstances changed and we all decided to move to this Thirroul area just south of Sydney. So I feel like the last couple of years has been a little bit figuring out what our next steps are, and now this is the next step. It's just kind of cementing everything and putting all the pieces in place now.
Nice. So the way I got connected to you was via Instagram. I found out your podcast from there and really like your Instagram, really liked some of your episodes as well. And so just got me intrigued into more about you and what you've been up to, I guess, in your life. So you've had a very varying career. So I was wondering if you could give me like a 1 minute rundown, if that's possible, of everything you've done in 40 years. No pressure, but.
20 years of career, I suppose, in 1 minute. So, I started my career, I guess, as a magazine journalist. So, I studied communications degree at uni, loved the journalism side of things, always loved kind of being part of what's going on in the world right now. First decade of my career, essentially, I worked in women's magazines in the end. I thought I'd go into newspapers actually at the beginning, but my first job happened to be at a women's magazine. And, once you got your foot in the door of an industry like that, you keep going. But I guess I always knew it had a bit of a lifespan for me. There was, at the time, women's magazines were, very glamorous place to be, but you weren't necessarily covering the most serious of stories. And, I always had that other interest. My other major at uni was social, political and historical studies. So I always had, an interest in the big issues of the world. So, in my 30s, I went back and did a master's of international development, and I moved into the not-for-profit sector. So, the last 10 years really has been working still in communications roles. So I didn't completely shift away from the writing and the media side of things. But last 10 years has been in the international aid space, and then also working for a domestic charity as well.
Yeah, nice. And it seems like you've sort of come full circle with your podcast as well. And now that you're, being the interviewing as well, so you've moved into more the journalist like audio format, the interviewee sector, not just the magazines and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, that's what really interested me, because it was a little bit of harking back to, I've always loved storytelling, and I still got to do plenty of that in my not-for-profit jobs. Little bit less so once you reach manager level, but that's still there. But I liked the idea of kind of rekindling my journalism skills in a new format.
Yeah, nice. So I guess like the intrinsic motivation, like what really drew you to journalism? Was it the getting paid to interact with other people and find out their stories and put, I guess, their stories in your own words? Was it, just like, well, I suppose what really drew you to that?
I think at the core of it was the writing. I always loved writing. There's a running joke in my family that I was reading from a very young age as well.
Yeah.
There's recordings of me reading at the age of 2, which I like to bring out every now and again. So definitely I always loved writing. And I think, when it came to choosing a uni course, I think like anyone at that age, it was all a little bit, you couldn't actually put your finger on what any of these courses were going to look like in the real world. But no, when I looked through the handbook of options at the time, I just thought it was the only one really that appealed to me, because it felt very real world, like what you were studying was about things happening right now. Definitely. I'm very interested in other people and how they choose to live their lives, and I guess the very different ways that people live. As a journalist, you get to interview people from all walks of life. Working in women's magazines, I was interviewing Hollywood stars and whatnot. I've interviewed, before, while I was still at uni, one of my favourite things to do, I was working for various community newspapers at the time. So I was a very young journalist, but I was interviewing politicians and talking to them about issues just in our local area. I think it's just an opportunity. As a journalist, you get to do things that seem very out of the ordinary. You get to dip into people's worlds, learn about all sorts of things. As I said, if you're interviewing people from all walks of life, you're having to research, their backstories and things. So you're just constantly learning and, meeting very interesting people.
Yeah, I had a little bit of look at your LinkedIn and what actual positions you had and whatnot, and it seemed like, especially in that early part of your career in your 20s, where you had like a gig like once every year or something. It seems like you're really changing a lot. Is that typical for a journalist? Is that typical?
It kind of was at the time. It's funny. I was just looking at my CV this week and I was like, it gets harder and harder to condense it into 2 pages when you've been working for 20 years. But no, definitely back in the day in magazines, it was a fast moving industry, and it was very common to, most of the big publishing houses at the time had quite a few magazines within them. And I worked at most of the publishing houses back then. There was Pacific, EMAP, and what was ACP magazines at the time, owned by Kerry Packer, but now called Bauer Media. So you were, you'd see jobs advertised we had the intranets back in the day, or you just get tapped on the shoulder for something. So I think for the 10 years that I was in mags, probably I think the longest stint I had was 2.5 years in one role when we launched the Australian edition of OK magazine here.
Yeah.
But it was common to move around and everyone knew everyone. Like, it was that's what I was kind of saying, once you had your foot in the door of an industry like that, you just stayed because it was, pretty tight-knit group, and yeah, lots of interesting opportunities would come up.
Yeah, nice. Do you think you'd try and do the same nowadays? I mean, like obviously magazines and newspapers are, I suppose, on the decline, at least the physical versions. But there's still, I guess, like the booming of the online sort of stuff. Do you think you would have gone the same sort of route, like the same sort of journalistic route nowadays, or if it was, I don't know, more communications, focusing more on that side of things?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think for anyone who's studying a communications or journalism degree now, I mean, the options are just so completely different. I mean, even though obviously we have a plethora of digital media, I just don't know how easy the path is now and what the pay is like. I mean, back in the glory days of magazines, the pay was even pretty good.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in some ways maybe the route I probably still would have given it a go. I mean, to be honest, even back at the time I studied, it wasn't easy to get a job necessarily. It wasn't seen as a given that you'd finish your comms degree and come out with a job at the end of it. So I suppose, I'd probably still go that path now. But yeah, who knows what it would look like. I mean, you're right. I mean, I actually chose to leave mags before the real decline happened in terms of print. But a lot of the people I worked with, it was a whole shake-up for them. They had to relearn a whole lot of skills. Some people did it more willingly than others. Some people did it more successfully than others. But yeah, I think if you were to go into that industry now, you'd have to be prepared for it to be a very non-linear path. Potentially, you'd have to have all the digital skills. And yeah, you'd have to be pretty adaptable, I'd say, because a lot of the digital media are still figuring out how to make money. I think some of them are doing it very successfully now, but it's a very fragmented industry. So yeah, and constantly changing. I mean, who knew that podcasts were going to be a thing not so long, and still growing. I mean, it's not, I think the latest stats still show, I think it's something like 22% of Aussies have listened to a podcast or regularly listen to podcasts. So it's definitely a medium that's still growing. But again, as a career or as a way to make money, I mean, that's certainly not the case for everyone either.
Yeah, for sure. I think they say there's around 1 million podcasts, and it's like, oh wow, that's such a big number. But then you compare it to there's 500 million blogs. So
well, exactly.
It's really not that.
And how many books, and lots of books as well. I mean, that's something I've heard recently as well of, because I think a whole bunch of those podcasts were launched during COVID. I mean, there was an absolute explosion.
Yeah. I regularly troll on Instagram, like adding other podcasts and interesting ones and seeing the trends. And like, I cannot tell you how many I saw, which were like quarantine. So like people with teacups.
Oh, right.
There was probably like at least 20, 30 of those that I saw. Millennials in their 20s, like figuring out your 20s was also a very popular topic.
Yes.
Yeah, you'll find some big batches of similarities.
Oh, totally. And, I think people are getting inspired by what they see elsewhere. I mean, talking about the 20s, that Shameless podcast, which was launched by two women in their 20s. I mean, that's just gone absolutely gangbusters. So I'm sure that's encouraged a lot of people in that age group as well. But yeah, I remember during the earlier stages of lockdown, there's a podcast, a Facebook group that I'm a part of, and there's a lot of commentary saying apparently all the microphone that I used had sold out. No one could get a microphone anywhere. It was like everyone had suddenly decided they had stuff to say during COVID. So yeah, it's definitely growing, but that's probably a good thing. More people are getting to know about it. More people are becoming interested in the medium, and there'll be a whole lot of people that don't necessarily do a good job of it, but if they're enjoying it and it feels good for them, then why not?
Yeah, for sure. I do want to come back to your podcast in particular, but I first wanted to just touch again on your I guess like transition into the communication in the especially with the charities. What drove you, I suppose, to go to those sorts of areas, and like what was that change? Because it is quite a different change going from an editor, publisher, journalist, I suppose, into those communication roles at a higher level.
Yeah, well, I guess I remember when I changed at the time, people were like, but you were working at celebrity magazines and now you're at a charity. How does that work? And I was like,
Yeah.
well, actually, the skills are very transferable in terms of the skills of knowing how to tell a story and to, interview people. But I suppose the interest had come largely from, well, a few things. One was my love of travel, and, I'd done a lot of travel to pretty interesting places, and I love the idea of being able to combine work and travel. So initially, the first charity I worked for, as I mentioned, was in the international aid space. So, we were working with children in developing countries all over the world. So and I love interacting with people from different places and different cultures. So that was probably one aspect that particularly drew me initially to the international aid and development space. But I also I guess I'd had a strong sense of, social justice and interest in some of the big things happening in the world from a pretty young age as well. And I think at the time in my early 20s, I remember there was a lot of stuff happening with refugees in Australia, and that really upset me. Some of the policies that we had here, and, some of the places I travelled to as a volunteer. So when I was in my early 20s, I did a volunteer stint in Brazil, which actually is something that I don't recommend so much these days.
Yeah.
One of my podcast episodes is about if you are going to volunteer overseas, there's actually a lot of considerations around, are you qualified to do that? But in any case, before I knew all of that, I'd spent about 3 months volunteering in Brazil, in my early or mid-20s, and that had definitely piqued my interest in working with I guess people living in places that have a lot less than we do. It was such an eye-opener at that age, and it stuck with me, and I was pretty keen to get involved in a bigger way.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, speaking of that, so that's one of the things I suppose, really struggled with a lot, is that I haven't really done much volunteering or even giving to charities, just because I've read a couple of books, especially, which like put me off I guess, like, the amount of waste that you can sort of see in some of these systems, and just my own personal experience working in a big mining company, Rio Tinto, and just when you get groups of people together, sometimes, like, the goals shift and change, and it's hard to be effective. And that's one of the things I really like being like. I like to feel if when I'm doing something, it's effective. How would you suggest someone, if especially someone like me who's really just trying to, I've been using that as like an excuse for a while, and I want to, stop doing that. I feel like I do have, I can contribute to helping others and whatnot. How would you suggest someone goes about starting off something like that? So, volunteering or joining a charity or something like that.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think one of the common things that we would hear and that I would have to combat when I was working in comms in charity was this idea of waste or admin costs. And, I think there's just a lot of, I guess, misinformation, or just people, not really necessarily understanding exactly how charities work and why they work the way they do. And of course, if you do hear a story of one bad apple, that obviously makes the news, and then that taints the whole industry. But
yeah.
I think, it's certainly when you work for a charity the charity sector is so rigorously monitored and regulated in Australia. So, you're pretty hard pressed to find one whose name you would know that was doing anything bad.
Yeah.
And I guess charities continue to try and more really talk about the outcomes of what they're achieving, because I think particularly in the international aid space, it can feel like we've been hearing about these problems for decades, and has anything really changed? And so we used to talk about that a lot, like what has changed? How do we communicate that? How do we help people understand that what they're doing does make a difference? And of course, there's always going to be more to do, and the issues change as well. I mean, the world keeps changing. The types of problems that crop up can keep changing. So I think, in terms of getting involved, just quickly touching on the volunteer thing I talked about, one of the podcast episodes that I ran in the first season of my podcast was with the CEO of a charity called Human and Hope, and she's become very known. In fact, she's got an Order of Australia medal for talking a lot about not getting involved in voluntourism. So I don't know if that's a term that you've come across before, but that's what I mentioned, where you do short-term volunteering usually in a developing country.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, but I met plenty of people doing that while I was traveling. And yeah, I could sort of see how it was like, I don't know, a lot of them seemed like they needed to fix themselves first before they were going around and help others.
Well, I think it's a very rewarding experience for you as the volunteer, and certainly I got a lot out of it when I did it, and I was able to incorporate it with bits of travel. But I think that's the whole point. You're not supposed to be doing things for your own benefit when you're actually trying to help someone else. So I think, some of the things I've learned about voluntourism, and I think, people are starting to get their heads around it a bit more. I know Sally Hetherington, this woman I was just referring to, she goes to speak at universities and things to try and help people understand why it might not be such a good thing to do. And essentially it comes down to, if you have no skills in that area, if you're going to go and build a house in a country, you wouldn't be doing it in Australia. So why would you be doing it in another country? So it's partly about thinking about what are you actually skilled at. And I guess I would say, if you do want to get involved, there are skilled volunteering positions that come up, and a lot of them are run through the Australian government. So it's good to go through, a reputable organisation. So longer term, they tend to sort of talk about longer term, 1 to 2 year positions that might come up where they're directly needing your skill set and you're transferring those skills to someone in a local community. So you're building the capacity of the local people, that kind of thing can have its benefits. But the shorter term sort of, I'm off to wherever for a month and I'm going to teach English, even though I've never done that before and I don't actually know how to do that. I guess you just have to think of it. Of course, it's done with good intentions, and I think that's why it can be quite a challenging issue to raise, because it's not about telling people you're doing the wrong thing or you're a bad person. I mean, I sort of had to reflect on what I did at the time, going, well, I didn't know any better when I did it. I don't think I did any harm necessarily, the type of things we were doing, but I don't know how, valuable it was necessarily for the communities we were in either. I got heaps out of it. And I suppose one thing positive was that it did encourage me to learn more and to move into that as a profession, so to speak. So, there were benefits, I suppose, that came out of it in the longer term.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess if you want to help as a volunteer, certainly look at what your own skills are. I mean, even in Australia, there's a lot of charities that need skilled volunteers to lend their time and their expertise, because things are expensive and charities are often running on very meagre budgets. But yeah, in terms of donating, I mean, it's a hard one because you really just have to do your research. As I said, if the charity is, accredited by the right, the main charity regulator in Australia, you can look at annual reports and things. Every charity in Australia has to report back on how dollars were spent and what they were achieved. So, I think the onus is on you as a person to do a bit of research. I think people like things to be easy and just go, well, just tell me what to do and whatever. But you do actually have to do your own research a bit and find a charity that is meaningful for you. I mean, in my experience, there are plenty of good charities in Australia doing incredible things. Often you'll align with one over the other just based on your own values and what's important to you.
For sure. There was two things I just grabbed from that. So one was trying to do good, but having good intentions, but it not necessarily translating well. I spoke with Juan recently on our latest podcast about this lady who I was just speaking with, just normal conversation, and she tried to convert me to be a Jehovah's Witness. And it was just so abrupt. It was the way she did it was just made me think okay, this lady's absolutely crazy. The problem was I have no doubt in her mind, she was trying to save my soul, trying to, stop me from going to hell and whatnot. It's not really about the religion. It was more about the way she went about it, which really, really put me off. And that's just one little snippet there of having very good intentions, but it not translating in a pragmatic way.
No, totally. Yeah, I think, we talk about good intentions having to meet good practice, and that does come with learning. And again, it's doing your own research, but I suppose people in this space like Sally that I just mentioned, I mean, she has a book called It's Not About Me. I haven't actually read it, but I've heard good things. And when I spoke to her about and because she tells it through her own experience, she went off to Cambodia in her mid-20s like many young Aussies do. She volunteered. She came to the realizations that actually helping people should be done by people within that community. Local people understand their issues best. So even though there is a place to come in and lend skills and certainly lend money or donate money for countries that really don't have it, it's about learning best practice and making sure that you are actually helping and not doing more harm, or certainly not just doing it for yourself, I guess.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask was, as a communications director, so you were saying like you were trying to guess, like get the stories out of what the charities were doing, and how that would influence the people watching it to get the desired outcome you wanted, whether it be people to donate, whether it be to help out, or even just spread the brand awareness. How did you like balance that line between, you were mentioning like showing that there's been progress and that things are happening, but also that there's still way more work to be done? Because it's always like, you don't want it to be always negative, but you also want to show like it's, you're actually doing good at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's through telling those human stories. So, statistics have a place, I suppose, and certainly we shared our fair share of those, but it's telling the human story. So it's, when you're going to these places and meeting the mothers of the children who've seen the difference that having clean water in their community has made, or that's excited that their child is getting an education that they never had the chance to get. I think it's those individual stories that tend to have the biggest impact. And so that's why we would take the time to really shine a light on those personal stories, because that's what brings to life, all of this work that's being done. And it might not, yes, you can then point back to, well, this country might still not be doing great economically, or whatever the bigger picture side of it is. But, to know that you have actually literally transformed the life of a child or a family or a whole community, I mean, that's pretty special. And so we would really try and share those stories as much as we could.
Yeah, nice. So I'm switching onto your podcast now, the She Did Next podcast, which is also about sharing stories. What was your like intrinsic motivation for starting that? Particularly like why did you focus on women in particular? What drove you to create the podcast in that way?
Yeah, well, I guess, so I was very interested in podcasting for a while. The last couple of charities I worked for, I was the one going, we need to do a podcast. And didn't really know how to make that happen at that point, but I'd become such a consumer of them myself. And I guess what I was enjoying listening to was the podcast by women. There weren't a huge amount at the beginning that I was coming across made in Australia. I think there was one that I'd started to listen to called Second Life, which is an American podcast, which is in some ways has a similar theme to mine. So I guess I should preface by saying, so what She Did Next really focuses on women who've made an inspiring career or life change of some sort. And yeah, I guess Second Life and a couple of others I'd come across, they were sort of about that whole career pivot. And I'm a bit loath to use the word pivot because it's kind of
you and me
hackneyed now. So I specifically do not use that word normally.
Endeared yourself to me tremendously, just hatred of that word.
But yeah, and a friend had put me onto Second Life, and I'd sort of started listening to some of them, and I was like, oh, this is, it's an interesting format. I liked this hour-long conversations or whatever it was with women, 40 minutes sometimes, but they were particularly focusing on women in quite glamorous industries. It was all very, beauty and fashion, and they were all American women. So I kind of just started to think, I'm enjoying this type of storytelling, but I want to hear more from Australian women, and I don't just want to hear from women who, have the beautiful influencer accounts on Instagram. Like, I'm interested in women who work in all sorts of fields, but particularly women, I suppose, who have found a way to use their skills in a positive way, or, you know, found that they've found their voice, I suppose, on an issue that really matters to them. So, I mean, they are career conversations, and I think I wanted to use that lens because, you know, I know, you know, I'm in my early 40s now. I've sort of felt ready for my new chapter in my career. I know a lot of my own friends were reaching points in their personal lives or in their careers that they were making big decisions about what was next for them. And so, yeah, I guess I just thought, well, I finished up my last full-time job in June last year, and I'd kind of decided to give myself a year to not work full-time and to explore some of the creative projects, I guess, and just some of, you know, have a real think about what I wanted my own next 20 years or so of working life to look like. And I had a lot of interesting women in my own network to begin with. So I think I'd been inspired by just some of the stories of my own friends. I think one of the first episode that I recorded and put out, which was with a friend of mine, Kelly Stanbury. She'd gone off to live in Fiji with her family for 3 years. Like she'd worked in the travel industry. Her and her partner both do, actually, and she was quite high up as a travel exec. But yeah, her partner had an opportunity to move with his work to Fiji, and off they went. And she took that time. She wasn't allowed to work or even volunteer as a expat over there. So she decided, well, how can she use these 3 years they were going to be there to be beneficial for her too? I mean, they were moving for her partner's job, but what could she do with 3 years in a beautiful tropical island? And, you know, she ended up studying an MBA.
Drink ginger rum, it sounds like.
And there are, I guess, probably people that do that. And, you know, she's not averse to having a good time, but I think she just thought she'd never actually been to uni. She's from New Zealand originally, and she'd got into the travel industry in a different way, and she'd always kind of felt what was missing for her was a degree. But so long story short, she ended up studying an MBA remotely, so through an Australian uni. But she also then launched or set up a social enterprise. So she really wanted to find a way to set up a business that did good for, you know, not just that made a profit, but that supported local farmers in Fiji. You know, she started making this product in her kitchen while she was living in Fiji, and she's now sort of scaled it up to be a ginger elixir drink that you can, you know, buy in duty free over in Fiji or in the resorts, and also back here. So, you know, I guess it was starting to hear some of my own friends doing really interesting things, some of which were quite left field. But they were like, why not? Like, it's, you know, we have all these choices now. We're very lucky to live in a time, you know, when we can design our lives in so many different ways. And, you know, but it's not, it can be scary to take a leap and try something new. So I guess I just wanted to shine a light on women who are making these big, brave choices and following their curiosity in whatever way it might be. And then I guess because of my own interests, I, you know, particularly do shine a light on women who are doing good things, you know, doing good in the world.
Yeah. What I really like with your podcast is you get into like the origin story. So it's not just you know, is it Heather, who's, I've forgotten her last name, McKinney? Heather, who has that, you know, tremendous like 3 or 4 books, or however many books she has now of the food.
Hetty McKinnon. Yes.
But yeah, you know, you start off that one with talking about how she was just making salads in her home, you know, literally putting them in like Tupperware containers and driving them all around the neighborhood. Same with Kelly when she was, you know, starting her ginger elixir, just, you know, making bottles in her kitchen and whatnot. So it's really awesome to see those, I guess, how they evolve, not just from, you know, now they're at this, you know, amazing point where they've got a business, they're running, they're successful, but also, I guess, like, you know, the success they were feeling, you know, just doing it from their home, and how that, I guess, is like motivating to others. I mean, it's certainly motivating to me to hear of someone, you know, starting off something from scratch in their home and then turning it into something amazing.
Yeah, well, I think that journey to use another hackneyed term, is what was interesting to me, because I think, again, there are podcasts out there that are very focused on the success that people have had and what they're doing now. But I think, one of the things that I've certainly learned over the years is that nobody started, where they are now. Everyone, most people, unless they were, born into an extremely privileged family or something, have sort of had a very often, humble beginnings that, and not necessarily even started out where they are now. So I think it is really interesting and hopefully motivating for people to hear that, someone that came probably from a very similar background to them, that has the same, faced possibly similar obstacles to them, or had the same sort of, hopes or fears or whatever it was. I think that hopefully makes the stories more relatable, and makes people realize that most of us have very similar sort of concerns or worries or insecurities or whatever it might be, but you can overcome them, and people are overcoming them. And I think there's a lot of learning in other people's stories. I've learned a lot from hearing other women interviewed, so I hope that the stories that I'm sharing do the same for someone else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, only one data point here, but yeah, it's been very tremendously great for me to hear those stories. How do you go about choosing who you're going to have on? Because you've got 3.5 billion people to choose from with your podcast. So,
yes.
Do you have like a criteria, for example, or is it more just what captures your interest? Someone who's doing something particularly interesting. You already mentioned people who are helping out or doing something to help the community at large. Does that play a big part as well?
It has. I mean, I think initially, I really need to connect with their story. I'm sure you probably feel the same. Like if you're interviewing someone, you have to feel some connection or admiration or something to, do a good job of the interview and be genuinely interested in the story. So, a less tangible thing, I suppose, is that I just have to, I really admire every woman I talk to for some reason. I guess in the first season it was, I kind of knew I was just going to do it in season. So it wasn't about, I just had to frantically fill empty spaces. I wanted it to be quite selective, and I wanted it to be an interesting array, a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of careers and stories. So, I suppose it was a mixture of, and, I want it obviously to be interesting for the audience. So I definitely wanted to make sure that every person had a really interesting story to tell, whatever their job or their career background was. I definitely wanted to highlight women who were, I guess, living adventurous lives, like not necessarily just following what was expected for them or what they even might have once expected for themselves, that they've pushed beyond or tried something new. I think, definitely. Not everyone is, making this huge, and they're not all change makers, but I think particularly with the second season, I started, because more people were coming to me now as well and recommending people to me. I was having some amazing women brought forward to me who, it was for me just such a privilege to talk to them. Women that are doing incredible things in the not-for-profit space, or, the most recent one that wrapped up season 2 was with a young woman down in Melbourne, Lorna Deng, who she's of South Sudanese heritage, and she basically grew up in Australia, but she faced a lot of challenges when she finished uni finding work because of the way she looks or people's unconscious bias or whatever it is. And so she's now out there starting her own recruitment platform specifically to support people from minority backgrounds. So, I think, I would like to think anyone that hears these stories goes, oh my God, that's so cool. I want to hear more about this person. So I think if that's my reaction to it, then that is a pretty good sign that there's someone that, would be a good fit for the show. And, as I said, it's got to be someone, because of the whole premise of the show being someone that's made an inspiring career or life change, then, there needs to be something in the narrative, whether they've made an actual career change or maybe they've started a business or started a not-for-profit, there's something new. The common thread, I guess, is that they've given something new a go.
Yeah, nice. And you can really see that, I think, in a lot of your, well, all of your guests, I suppose that they have had like a moment or something that switched where they're like, no, I'm not going to do like the normal thing now. I'm going to try out something new. And it's really
Mm.
inspiring to see that. I'm really, really enjoying it.
Oh, thank
I
you.
wanted to just get onto travel now as well, because this is a big passion of me. You can see behind me, I've got my map of South
Yes.
America, which I
And actually, yeah, I'm sitting in my brother's
yeah, I
study,
can see
but
that
there's a
on
lot of
corner.
travel stuff around too.
Yeah. So, what like inspired you to travel initially, and did you go on your own to Brazil, for example? Was that something you did
I
solo?
did.
Oof, that's a
Yeah, so I guess
interesting
I
doing
did.
that in when was that, in the early 2000s? You went,
Yeah, I guess I was in my early to mid 20s. I can't remember
yeah.
exactly what year it was. But yeah,
I
I
have
did
it
go
written
on
down.
my own.
2003 is when you went.
Ah, there you go. You've done your research. Yeah, so well, I guess to answer your first question, yeah. So I mean, I have a much older brother and sister. They're 10 and 13 years older than me, and they both travelled. So I suppose I grew up seeing my sister go off backpacking and seeing my brother go off to live in the UK and do the thing that Aussies, well, I guess still do, but definitely
Yeah.
did back in the day. So yeah, it certainly was something I was probably introduced to quite early on. But yeah, my own travel, independent travel, I guess. I mean, I just bailed as soon as school was finished. I was never interested in schoolies or taking part in any of that, but I worked in my last couple of years of high school. I just worked in my cafe jobs and whatnot and saved up all of my money, and pretty much the second that the HSC in New South Wales Year 12 was done, I hopped on a plane over to the UK and did a gap year over in London. Did the whole traveling on a Eurobus through Europe for the summer. And yeah, so that was my first experience as a probably way too young now I think about it. I was only 17 when I took off. I had my 18th birthday in London.
Wow.
So yes, it was quite a formative year, as you can imagine. And I think, I thought I would always go back a bit later. Like a lot of my friends, my main group of friends now are all big travelers. We've all kind of met through our love of travel in some ways. And yeah, I think I always thought I would go back and do a longer stint in the UK after I'd done uni, because I basically took that year off to come back, and then I did my uni degree for 3 years. But yeah, I ended up meeting my partner, who I'm still with now, he's from Ireland. So he, didn't really have such an interest in going back to that side of the world when he'd come over here. So we ended up, having a lot of friends that had done the London thing, but in Sydney, rather than heading off traveling again then. So yeah, I think for Brazil, because I still had that travel urge, and I was like, well, I'm not going to go back to London just now. What else can I do? I started to look around for sort of things that I could do that wouldn't take me away from my partner for too long. So yeah, I headed off to Brazil on my own for, I think it was 3 or 4 months at the time, living with local families and all the rest of it. But yeah, a lot of my travel has been solo, actually. Certainly, a lot of my trips, but equally, I've done a lot of trips with girlfriends. So we're pretty renowned amongst our friend group for all of us girls getting together and heading off on pretty interesting adventures. So so they were some of my earlier trips, I guess.
Nice. I'm always flabbergasted at meeting people who can do that straight out of high school. Like it took me until I was 25, 26 till I went on my first big travel. And that was like I'd been to New Zealand before, but that doesn't really count. It's very similar to Australia. So yeah, for
It
me,
all
it was like,
counts.
I meet people like that and I just can't even comprehend like how you could do that when you're so young. It just seems insane.
Well, I almost can't now. Like I have, my nieces now, and I do think, oh my gosh, I don't know. I can't even imagine how my mum must have felt with me taking off. But I should say, my brother was in the UK, so I wasn't like completely let loose.
Yeah.
I had him over there looking out for me as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess it was just something I was determined to do. I was so excited about it, and I suppose I had, I had been lucky enough to go overseas with my family at a younger age as well. So it didn't seem completely strange to go off and then do it do it myself. But, it was such a different time back then. I mean, I just recently did realise it's 25 years since I took off on that first trip to the UK as a 17-year-old. And I mean, looking back at the photos from then, it is pretty insane. We didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have internet, we didn't have any of that. And, the trip that I did around Europe for those 3 months was just with 3 other girlfriends. And, we had no plan. We rocked up to places we didn't have anywhere to stay. Like, it was all, it was very different to how it would probably be done now.
Yeah, well,
and certainly very different to how I travel now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I backpacked, I guess, all through South America, and I was expecting, they're not going to have phones there. Still be careful. Like, don't keep your phone out. Don't look at maps when you're out in the street and whatnot. Everyone had one. Like, there was girls who were so lackadaisical that, they're putting it in their bra, they're putting it in like the back seat of their pants. It's like, okay, it's a very different experience, I suppose, traveling now, where a lot of people have smartphones, for example. So it's not.
Yeah, and you also tend to know a lot more about the place before you get there now. Like, I remember talking to my brother-in-law, who's older than me again, and he was traveling to insane places like Papua New Guinea back in the 70s, and places, and you literally would know nothing before you landed. You kind of just get off a plane with your bag and go, now what? And like, he was kind of lamenting that there's some of the, I guess, the romanticism in some ways of that kind of travel has been lost, because you are so prepared generally now. When you arrive somewhere, you've read everything there is, which is the best places to eat. Like, you kind of, some of that sense of discovery, I suppose, is a little bit lost in the way we do it now. But there's pros and cons, I guess, to having all of that information at our fingertips now before and while we're there.
I remember reading one of your articles, I think it was about the Manus Island, and it was talking about safety and how you'd never really felt that unsafe in different areas. Like, I think one of the first times was riding your bike or and things like that. So
not the most coordinated on a bike.
So while traveling, has there ever been a time where you've really felt like, oh, well, this is, I shouldn't be here, or this is like a little bit too extreme for me?
Yeah. Not too bad. I mean, I've been to some pretty extreme places, particularly when I was working in the international aid space. I mean, I did go to Papua New Guinea, which is probably the only country I've ever been to where we weren't allowed to leave the hotel, not even just at night. We weren't even allowed to walk to our office over there. We had to be picked up and transported. Like, it was known, it was, well, I mean, you could have been fine, but there are a lot of risks being in a place like that. But I felt very protected, and we had all the right protocols in place there. I think probably, and I was just saying this to someone the other day, like when I was in Brazil, a lot of the places I was living or visiting at the time were known, I guess, to be a bit unsafe. I mean, even Rio at that time, everyone knew about the favelas and, had a perception of how dangerous they were. But I think partly because of the way I look, maybe, like my dad's Malaysian, Chinese Malaysian. So when I'm in countries that, even though I'm not from there, sometimes I blend in a little bit. So like in Brazil, when I was there with some other volunteers, I actually felt safer when I was on my own walking around some places, because I could blend in a bit. Whereas there was a couple of the guy volunteers on that trip who were blonde, blue-eyed, stood out like a sore thumb, looked like a rich gringo, as they would call them, compared to some of the local people. So, I think sometimes I've been able to blend in and not feel too at risk or unsafe. There's been a couple of things which in hindsight probably weren't the safest. I think I actually mentioned in that article, I did open with talking about whitewater rafting in the Zambezi River with some friends. That probably wasn't the safest, because it turned out our boat had a hole in it. So the whole way we were coming down the river, we were losing air. And so we were meant to be in what the guide had called the chicken boat. So for anyone that was scared of the whitewater rapids, they put us all in this one boat, which was meant to be the safe one. They weren't going to do any crazy tricks or anything. But our boat was the one that did flip because it had run out of air. So we hit the tiniest of rapids. All of the chickens, i.e. us, ended up in the water. freaking out. And that, you know, they rescued us all, but we didn't get back in after. We were on strike after that. We were like, we're not going any further. So yeah, it's probably more random things that you wouldn't expect that felt unsafe, and in the things that perhaps did, you know, you might have thought would be more unsafe didn't. I mean, I traveled to Ethiopia and Uganda and places like that with some of my work, and you know, they're places, I suppose, that people might seem scared of just because they're unfamiliar. They haven't been there. We don't hear a lot about them in the news except for perhaps some of the bad things going on. But, you know, I think as we all get to learn as we get older, what you see in the news is certainly not the entirety of a place. And I mean, Ethiopia is still one of my favourite places that I've ever been, and one of the most surprising because I didn't know much about it. So, you know, those sort of travel adventures can still be very, can be among the best. I think they really stimulate you because everything's so new and different.
For sure. There's I've got my own personal experience in Cancun in Mexico, where I went out with my friend Juan and another friend, and basically like the night ended up with me waking up in a jail cell surrounded by like other Mexicans. And the funny thing is, like, that didn't feel unsafe to me at all. But then I'd compare it to being in like the capital of Guatemala City. And, you know, I was in like the main plaza there, and I felt super, super unsafe in that place. It was just, you know, it's just the small things, like lots of young men hanging around with nothing to do on a weekday. You know, just people walking very close together, like being just like the whole atmosphere felt very different. So it's like, you know, it's so strange how one scenario where you're like, yeah, you're in a jail cell, you think this would be bad, but it's really not. It's more like the context and the, you know, I hate to use non like scientific or rational explanations, but it's like the vibe in the air, you know, it's the ambience.
No, totally. Well, it's your instincts, and I think they can be very powerful and, you know, and keep you safe. I mean, we have those instincts because we've, you know, evolved over time to have to keep ourselves alive and survive. So, you know, and the more travel you do and the more independence, I guess, you gain, you do develop those instincts. And yeah, I've certainly listened to them. I mean, it's not like I go to a place and just, you know, think, oh, I'm completely fine and don't pay attention to my surroundings or anything. I'm definitely, you know, conscious of what's around, and you know, I wouldn't purposely put myself in a stupid position. But yeah, I think it also just goes to show that, you know, another friend of mine who's a travel writer and also interviewed in the podcast, you know, she said the more places she goes, the more she just realizes the inherent kindness of people. And, you know, by far and away, the experiences that you have when you travel, or certainly that I've had, is the amazing things. The great side of people that you see is the people that helped you. Even in New York, I mean, places like that where, you know, it's a massive city and you can just think people are caught up doing their own thing. I mean, people continually went out of their way to help me in New York if I had my map out, or, you know, I lived there for a couple of months on my own, and, you know, it's a fairly easy city to get around, but there was more than one occasion where I'd be, on a street corner looking at my map looking obviously like I didn't know what I was doing. And people would come up to you and, you know, you didn't even have to ask. They would come up and offer help. So, yeah, I think those sort of experiences remind you of the good things in the world.
For sure. All right, to finish off, I've just got like a couple of little random questions. So because we're on the theme of travel, what's the next place you'd go to? Say all the borders open up, you can fly wherever you want. Where's destination numero uno?
Oh, well, I feel like, I mean, as I mentioned, we have family in a lot of places. So probably first off the bat, we'd want to make sure we were covering all bases and catching up with family. Well, luckily they live in quite interesting places. So we'd probably do a quick scoot to New Zealand to see my partner's sister there. They're in beautiful Wanaka in the South Island of New Zealand. Nice. We'd definitely have to pop over to Europe, see the family in Ireland, see my dad in Malaysia. But probably the slightly more, well, not, I shouldn't say more interesting. My family's very interesting.
Exotic, maybe.
we've been talking for a while. It's a whole bunch of our friends who we hung out with for a long time, who are from different parts of Africa, have moved back there. So quite a few of our good friends moved back to South Africa in the last few years after, doing long stints living in the UK and then Australia. So we have been talking to them about really wanting to go and see them. We did an Africa trip. I think it was before the Brazil trip, actually, so a very long time ago now, where we went to a friend's wedding in Zambia and then did a trip down to South Africa. But we've got four or five good friends living there now. It's been pretty long time since we went to that part, just for fun. I mean, as I said, I've been to Africa for work, but not with my partner, to just go and see beautiful things. And I still remember, going on safari for the first time on the last trip we did to South Africa, and it was, one of the most mind-blowing things ever, seeing those creatures in the wild. So yeah, maybe that's what we would try and get to sooner rather than later.
Yeah, one of the recommendations I give for people before traveling is like put some effort into meeting people in your own city or wherever you're from who are from there, and then it's almost like it's an impetus, an excuse to go. And it seems like you've got family and friends everywhere, so it doesn't feel like I'm holiday, I'm relaxing. It's like, no, I need to go. There's a reason I need to go. Convince yourself to do it.
No, totally. Yeah, I feel quite lucky that we did meet so many friends back in our 20s who were, all living in Australia from different places. So yeah, I love when you can go to all sorts of countries and have a connection there. It's one of my favorite things. So yes, hopefully, we kept thinking that the borders might open next year. Who knows if that's going to happen? Yeah. But, as we keep saying, there's lots of interesting places in Australia to visit too. So we're happy to notch up a few more of those before, if we can't go any further for now.
Nice. What do you read much out of interest?
I do. Well, yeah, I do on and off. I go through absolute stints of devouring books. And then I found with COVID, I just couldn't, I don't know if it was, that underlying anxiety people were talking about. Yeah. I was finding for a while there, I couldn't relax enough to properly read. But yes, I do read quite a bit as a rule.
Do you have any really influential books that have, I suppose, like shaped you or changed you or made you decide on doing something?
Yes. I mean, gosh, there's been a lot over the years. I mean, I probably would have to say, bringing it back to the podcast, that probably one of the books that really influenced me just before launching the podcast was Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, which is probably a very cliched one to mention. But, I think the reason it's become a cliche is just because it was such a, just to hear a woman like that talk about, talking about humble beginnings. I mean, her and Barack both came from very humble beginnings and look where they ended up. But I think what really touched me about her book was just, she was so open. I mean, talking about people's journeys as we were before about, not just where they're at now, but everything that happened in the lead up to that. I mean, her book is the epitome of that kind of storytelling where, I was so struck by the level of detail that she could remember of all sorts of things from her childhood right through. But yeah, I think that was influential to me because she had a non-linear career path as well. I mean, she went into law initially. As she said, she was ticking all the boxes she was supposed to, coming from a family that wasn't particularly well off, but they'd invested so much in her education and everything had been thrown at making sure she had the opportunities that her parents didn't necessarily have. So, initially she was this high-flying lawyer. She was making good money, but, she really ended up feeling more of a pull to the not-for-profit sector. And there was a lot of angst, I think, at one point about making that move. And then, of course, so her life was so interesting before she even met someone called Barack Obama. Yeah. By the time she got to the part in the book where she met him, I was almost like, I forgot that there's a key part of her life that's come in the form of him. But yeah, I think the other part that I loved was that she just, she was so open again about not just what happened in their time in the White House, but all of the fears and worries and what was going on behind the scenes that you would just have no clue of when you would see them coming out looking so poised on a stage and just they seem to just go through that period not putting a foot wrong in a lot of ways, or certainly it looked like that from where I was sitting. So yeah, to really get this sense of all the worries that she had about their family life and what it would mean for her girls and what it would mean for her. Like, yeah, it was just so interesting to have that insight, just for someone to be so themselves. And she didn't need to be. I mean, she doesn't need to reveal all of this about herself, and she wasn't doing it in a way to be like, I'm so amazing. I think she was doing it to show that we all, you can come from humble beginnings, first of all, that we all do have, these worries and fears, and that's perfectly fine, but you can get past those. So it was all the things, I suppose, that I like to highlight in the stories of the women that I speak to. But yeah, I was very inspired by the way she told that story. And I suppose it comes back in some ways to, for so many years we were told that thing of fake it till you make it. Like, if you don't feel confident in something, just this whole thing of fake it till you make it. And now it's all about authenticity and kind of people actually sharing their vulnerabilities and sharing all of those things I just spoke about, the worries. And so I think that's probably a good shift, that we're not all sitting here faking it till we make it and think that everyone else has got the answers, or that everyone else is more talented than we are or more confident than we are. We can all achieve great things, but we just have to have that self-belief. And the more that I think we share those stories of, how we've come to where we are, it's beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. I think that fake it till you make it advice needs to be, caveated with the next step beyond it. Like, you can't just use that and say, like, I've got it, I just got to fake it till I make it, and then I'm done. It's like, no, okay, maybe use that for like the first 20%, and then from then on, be authentic, be, genuine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, like sometimes you do, if you're not feeling confident or whatever, that can be a good way to sort of, build up that initial sort of impetus to do something. But yeah, I don't think it's that helpful to anyone to just pretend that your life's amazing and that you know everything and there was no struggle to get to where you are. It's not very real.
Yeah. The last question I wanted to ask is one that's, I suppose, really important to me, and one it's something we spend a lot of time thinking of and putting into practice for ourselves, which is goal setting and I guess like the process of how you set goals, how you make sure that you go where you're actually aiming for. Do you have any like routine or a process that you use on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis that you use to, I guess, direct yourself?
I'd have to say, I don't think broadly in my life I'm a huge planner.
Yeah.
I think what I am, though, is very deadline driven. I think because of my background as a journalist, where your whole working life revolves around deadlines. So I feel like whether it's just developed as a habit because of my earlier career or if I'm just that way inclined anyway, I tend to work best by setting a deadline for myself and then working backwards from there. So, I mean, even with launching the podcast, for example, I'd kind of given myself this year off in a sense, although I have still been consulting and working a bit on the side, but I really had it in my head that I wanted to launch this podcast in January this year. I think because it is a podcast about new beginnings and new career chapters and stuff like that, I kind of thought January that's a very good time. It's a new year, new start for a lot of people. And, I had pre-recorded my interviews at the end of the previous year, but everything from the editing process to just all of it took so much longer than I thought, but I was determined I was going to hit that deadline of getting it done in January. And I think my trailer episode went up on the 29th of January. So
I was going to say, because I think the first one I was listening to today was published on February 2nd. So I was like, oh, maybe you didn't get it.
No, I think Apple approved it like in the February time, but I definitely uploaded it to Whooshka on the 29th of January. So in my mind, I'd hit the deadline. And the thing is, I literally killed myself to get that first trailer up. So in some ways I could have just gone, well, it really doesn't matter that much if it goes out in the first week of February. But I guess that's my version of goal setting, if you can call it that, that if I do better deadline for myself. I really, really like to meet it, and I do what it takes to get there. So I don't know if that's a
No,
works for everyone.
that's a very good, effective way. At the very least, like even if you're not, pushing yourself in the right direction, you'll know very quickly if you've got a deadline coming up, like whether it's
Yes.
something useful or not.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that would be the best tip I can offer. But I think in terms of lessons learned and things, though, I do think I've certainly had to learn also just to let myself rest when you need to as well. I think because I do push myself so much to achieve the things that I want to do, you can forget sometimes that some days you do just need to let yourself rest and recover. I think I was just even talking to my brother about this now. He's got a very busy workload too. And I think some days if you do just reach a day where because you're probably not being very productive if you're exhausted or if you've depleted
Exactly.
yourself. So I think it still is finding that balance between, pushing yourself to get things done. But if you really needing that time out, you'll actually benefit from that as well. So I'm still learning to strike that balance.
Nice. And that's it. Just trying to find that balance in life, whether it's through work, career, or even rest,
Yes.
Jacqui, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. I really, really enjoyed this, and I really enjoy what you're doing with the What She Did Next
Thank
podcast.
you. Well,
If
you
you
guys
wanted
too, I
to
think.
direct people to interact with you, or what's the best way they can get in touch with you or listen to what you're putting out?
Yeah, well, I'm most active on Instagram. So the podcast has an account which is at What She Did Next Podcast, all one handle, obviously. So yeah, most active there. I am on Facebook as well, but a little bit less active on that account. And if you'd like to listen to the show, it's probably easiest just to search What She Did Next in whatever your favorite podcast app is, or on Apple and Google and Spotify and all of the major platforms. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for having me on.
No worries. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for coming.